Welcome, and let's take a quiet step back into the world of the Middle Ages. Not into the castles or battlefields, but into the ordinary rhythm of daily life. This is where most of history truly lived, in the cottages, the fields, the workshops, and the marketplaces. Together, we'll explore how people woke in the early hours, what they ate, how they dressed, the work that filled their days, the prayers that shaped their weeks, and the small celebrations that brightened even the hardest seasons. But before we begin, I'd love to know, which country are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Is it late at night as you settle down to rest? Or perhaps early morning as you let this calm story play in the background? Wherever you are, let your mind drift gently as we enter the textures of medieval daily life. Slow, detailed and full of forgotten moments that shaped the centuries. Daily life in the Middle Ages unfolded within a rhythm shaped by faith, work, and survival. The majority of people were peasants living in small villages scattered across the countryside. Their homes were modest, often built of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. A single room served as a central space for cooking, sleeping, and gathering as a family. The day for most villagers began with the first light of dawn. Roosters crowed, and families rose early to make use of the daylight hours. Men would head out to the fields, carrying simple tools like wooden plows or iron-tipped hoes. They worked long hours planting, tending, or harvesting crops depending on the season. Women, meanwhile, managed the household, tending to the fire, preparing bread from coarse rye or barley, and spinning wool into yarn. Food was simple and repetitive. For peasants, the staple was pottage, a thick stew made of grains, peas or beans, sometimes flavored with herbs from the garden. Meat was rare for the lower classes, often reserved for feast days. Bread, cheese, and ale formed the backbone of daily meals, with water often unsafe to drink. Those of higher status, such as nobles, enjoyed more variety, including roasted meats, spiced dishes, and imported wines. Faith played a central role in every aspect of life. The ringing of church bells marked the hours of prayer, guiding the rhythm of the village. Sundays and holy days offered a break from fieldwork, as the entire community gathered for Mass. The church calendar, filled with festivals and saints' days, structured not only worship, but also moments of rest and celebration. Workshops and trades also thrived in medieval towns. Blacksmiths forged tools and horseshoes, bakers prepared loaves in communal ovens, and cobblers crafted leather shoes. Guilds organized and regulated these crafts, ensuring that skills were passed down and standards maintained. Apprentices learned from masters over years of service before earning the right to practice on their own. Inside castles and manor houses, daily life was more refined but equally bound by duty. Lords managed estates, overseeing justice, rents, and military obligations, while ladies of the house supervised servants, embroidery, and the education of children. Meals were elaborate, with multiple courses and the use of spices like cinnamon and pepper that arrived through long trade routes. Entertainment included music, dancing, and storytelling by the fire. Children, whether peasant or noble, contributed to family life from a young age. Peasant children tended animals, fetched water, or helped in the fields, while noble children trained in manners, riding, and sometimes literacy. Play was also present, games with balls, wooden toys, or simple singing, but always balanced with responsibility. Clothing reflected one's station. Peasants wore tunics of wool or linen, dyed in earthy tones. Nobles dressed in finer fabrics like silk or velvet, decorated with embroidery and sometimes fur. The sumptuary laws in many regions restricted who could wear certain colors or materials, making clothing a clear marker of status. Though life in the Middle Ages was often hard, it was not without joy. Festivals filled villages with music and dance. Markets brought people together, and stories passed from generation to generation kept traditions alive. Beyond the work of fields and households, medieval daily life was deeply seasonal. Spring brought the sowing of barley, oats, and peas, with every able hand in the village lending strength to the plowing and planting. Summer was a season of maintenance, repairing fences, tending animals, and preparing tools for harvest. Autumn was the most demanding, as fields had to be cleared and grain threshed before the cold arrived. Winter, though quieter in the fields, carried its own labors, mending clothes, preserving food, and keeping fires alive. Each month brought a specific task, and the medieval farmer measured time not in hours, but in duties that the land demanded. Markets played an essential role in village and town life. Once or twice a week, villagers would gather at the nearest town to trade goods, buy salt, or sell surplus eggs and butter. These markets were not just economic centers, but also social ones. People exchanged news, heard proclamations from the local lord, or learned of royal edicts. Fairs, often tied to saints' feast days, were larger affairs attracting merchants from far away who sold fabrics, spices, and metal goods. For peasants, attending a fair was both an adventure and a rare glimpse into the wider world beyond their own fields. Time itself was measured differently from today. Most people did not own clocks, and mechanical ones were rare luxuries found in monasteries or great towns. Instead, daylight, shadows, and the tolling of church bells shaped the day. The bell signaled the beginning of work, the pause for a meal, or the gathering for evening prayers. Life moved according to natural rhythms, unhurried yet relentless in its demands. Travel was limited for the majority, but not impossible. Peasants usually remained within a few miles of their birthplace, bound to the land of their lord. Yet peddlers, friars, and wandering minstrels passed through villages, bringing stories and tidings from distant lands. Some peasants occasionally undertook pilgrimages, walking miles to visit holy shrines in hopes of healing, forgiveness, or blessings. For townsfolk and nobles, travel was more frequent, whether for trade, tournaments, or royal business. Roads were rough, often muddy and dangerous with the threat of bandits, but they remained the arteries of medieval movement. Hygiene and health also shaped daily existence. Baths were not absent from medieval life, as sometimes imagined. In fact, many towns had public bathhouses where men and women, though usually separated by time or space, would wash in hot water. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was used sparingly. Still, illness was common, with diseases like fevers, dysentery, and plague leaving heavy marks on communities. The care of the sick fell largely to family members, though monasteries offered more organized care, where monks and nuns tended to the poor and infirm. Education was limited but not entirely absent. In villages, knowledge was passed down orally through parents, elders, and traditions. Children learned skills by imitating their parents' work, a son guiding the plow, a daughter spinning at the wheel. In towns, cathedral schools and monasteries taught Latin, scripture, and sometimes mathematics to boys destined for the church. Noble children often had tutors who taught not only letters, but also music, courtesy, and the art of war. Though literacy was rare among peasants, memory and oral storytelling carried culture and history forward. Music and entertainment threaded through everyday life. Peasants sang as they worked in the fields, keeping rhythm with the swing of their scythes. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and fiddles accompanied festivals and dances. In towns, minstrels performed tales of chivalry, romance, and saints, while jesters brought humor to noble courts. Storytelling by the hearth, whether of local legends or biblical parables, kept families connected through long winter nights. Above all, medieval life was communal. Tasks such as plowing large fields or raising a new barn required neighbors to work together, and in turn, each family could rely on others for help when needed. Obligations were shared, meals were sometimes shared, and hardships were certainly shared. Survival depended not on individual effort alone, but on the bonds of the village and the network of trust within it. Diet shaped both survival and culture in medieval life. Bread was the staple food for nearly every household, whether peasant or noble. Peasants usually ate coarse, dark loaves made from rye, barley, or oats, while wealthier families consumed finer white bread made from wheat. Along with bread came pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, peas, and vegetables, simmered slowly over the hearth. Meat was rarer in peasant homes, often reserved for feast days, though pork, salted herring, an occasional game appeared when available. Nobles, by contrast, feasted on roasted venison, swan, or boar, served with sauces spiced from distant lands. Dairy, eggs, onions, leeks, and cabbages filled the everyday table, while honey sweetened drinks and dishes before sugar became common. Drink was another central part of daily life. Ale was the common beverage for peasants, brewed in small batches at home or purchased locally, since water could be unsafe. Children, too, drank weak ale. In towns and monasteries, beer brewing grew into an organized craft, with recipes carefully guarded. Wine was more common in southern regions and among wealthier classes. Though imported wines found their way into northern markets, cider, mead, and herbal infusions offered further variety. Religion infused every moment of the day. The rhythm of prayer, feast days, and fasting shaped the calendar. Sundays were reserved for Mass, and holy days punctuated the year with festivals, processions, and rituals. Lent and Advent required fasting, limiting meat and dairy, while Easter and Christmas brought joyful celebration. Local saints were honored with fairs, pilgrimages, and relics, and parish churches stood as both spiritual and social centers. For peasants, religion was woven into the soil they tilled and the seasons they endured. Every harvest a blessing, every storm a test. Law and justice formed another layer of everyday life. In villages, disputes were often settled by the local manor court, presided over by the Lord's steward or bailiff. Petty crimes like stealing firewood or grazing animals on another's land could result in fines. While more serious offenses might bring harsher punishments, trial by ordeal lingered in the early Middle Ages, where boiling water, hot irons, or drowning determined guilt or innocence, though later centuries saw greater reliance on witness testimony. In towns, guild courts, and civic officials enforced order, while royal justices traveled to hear larger cases. Craftsmanship and trades flourished, especially in towns, shaping the lives of those who were not bound to the plow. Blacksmiths forged tools and horseshoes, carpenters built furniture and wagons, potters shaped everyday vessels, and weavers produced cloth. Guilds regulated the quality of these crafts, trained apprentices, and protected the rights of their members. Life for an apprentice meant years of service under a master, learning a trade in exchange for food, lodging, and discipline. Journeymen traveled from town to town, seeking work and experience until they could establish themselves as masters. Festivals and leisure brought respite from labor. May Day, Midsummer, and harvest festivals saw villagers gather for dancing, singing, and games. Plays often performed by traveling players or in connection with religious feasts dramatized biblical stories or moral lessons. Tournaments entertained nobles, showcasing jousting, swordplay, and heraldic display, though peasants might watch from the sidelines. Even small joys, such as dice games, riddles, or playing with carved wooden toys, colored the long hours of winter evenings. Housing and settlement patterns shaped everyday experiences. Peasants lived in villages clustered around fields, with houses of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, and dirt floors. Smoke often lingered inside, as chimneys were rare in the early Middle Ages. Animals sometimes shared the same structure, providing warmth during the cold. In towns, houses rose taller, with upper stories jutting out over narrow streets, and workshops often stood directly below living quarters. Castles, monasteries, and churches towered as landmarks, dominating the skyline and reinforcing the hierarchy of society. Communication and news spread slowly but meaningfully. Proclamations were read aloud by town criers or announced after church services. Messengers carried letters for nobles, though literacy remained a barrier for most. Minstrels and merchants carried stories between communities, weaving together the fabric of rumor, legend, and truth. In this way, even distant events, a king's war, a pope's decree, or a famine in another region, gradually reached the ears of ordinary villagers. Clothing revealed much about a person's place in medieval society. Peasants wore garments made from coarse wool or linen, often in natural shades of brown, gray, or undyed cream. Men typically wore tunics belted at the waist with hose or simple trousers, while women wore long dresses with aprons and veils. Shoes were made of leather, but often went without soles, wearing thin quickly on muddy paths. Wealthier townsfolk and nobles displayed finer fabrics like silk or velvet, dyed in vivid reds, blues, or purples, using costly imported dyes. Sumptuary laws even restricted who could wear certain colors or fabrics, ensuring that clothing reinforced the strict boundaries of class. Personal hygiene, while limited by today's standards, was still valued. Peasants bathed in rivers or used wooden tubs when possible, though bathing was less frequent in colder climates. Soap, made from animal fat and lye, was harsh but effective. Monasteries often encouraged cleanliness, and public bathhouses were common in some towns until fears of disease led to their decline. Hair was washed with herbal rinses, teeth cleaned with cloth or twigs, and perfumes or scented oils used by the wealthy to mask odors. Though medieval hygiene was far from modern expectations, people sought ways to stay presentable within their means. The weather played a defining role in medieval daily life. Harsh winters could trap entire villages indoors, with only fires and preserved food for comfort. Spring brought planting, a season of hope, but also heavy work. Summers could bring drought, and autumn meant long days of harvest before the cold set in again. Floods, storms, and unseasonal frosts often caused famine, with communities praying fervently for mercy. Superstition mingled with practical observation. A red sunset might signal good weather, while unusual animal behavior was read as a sign of trouble to come. Education was rare outside monasteries and cathedral schools. Most peasants were illiterate, passing down knowledge through oral tradition. Children learned practical skills from their parents: farming, weaving, brewing, or cooking. In towns, some boys attended grammar schools, studying Latin, arithmetic, and religious texts, while a few fortunate girls received instruction in reading or embroidery from nuns. Universities, emerging in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, were largely reserved for the clergy and the elite, where students debated philosophy, law, and theology. Still, even among the unlettered, a wealth of practical wisdom of seasons, soil, sustained families through the centuries. Medicine in the Middle Ages combined folk remedies with emerging scholarly traditions. Peasants relied on herbal cures: garlic for infections, honey for wounds, chamomile for fevers. Charms and prayers accompanied many treatments, blending faith with medicine. Barber surgeons performed bloodletting, pulled teeth, and set bones, while apothecaries in towns sold ointments and powders. Monasteries preserved classical medical texts, teaching that health was a balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, however, was also seen as divine punishment, and healing often meant both prayer and poultice. Work tools and technology quietly shaped everyday existence. The heavy plow harnessed to oxen or horses allowed deeper cultivation of soil in northern Europe. The three-field system rotated crops of wheat, legumes, and fallow land, reducing hunger. Watermills and windmills powered grinding stones, saws, and hammers, reducing labor and fueling small industries. Iron tools such as scythes, sickles, and spades made fieldwork more efficient, while the spinning wheel and loom transformed raw wool into cloth. These innovations, simple yet profound, structured both time and survival. Entertainment and quieter moments reflected both creativity and necessity. Storytelling remained central, with tales of heroes, saints, and tricksters told by the hearth. Music filled village gatherings, played on fiddles, flutes, and drums. While nobles enjoyed lutes, harps, and courtly songs, games included chess among the elite, nine men's morris among common folk, and ball games played on village greens. Falconry, hunting, and feasting entertained nobles, while wrestling, running, and simple contests of strength filled the leisure of peasants. Death and remembrance also marked the rhythm of life. Mortality was ever present, with epidemics, childbirth, and accidents claiming lives at every age. Funerals brought entire communities together, with prayers for the departed soul and meals for the living. Graveyards clustered around churches, their stones slowly weathering in the rain. Remembrance of the dead was woven into festivals like All Souls' Day, when families lit candles and prayed for ancestors. Though life was brief for many, the sense of continuity of family, faith, and community carried people through grief. Travel for ordinary people was limited, but not absent. Most peasants lived their entire lives within a few miles of their birthplace, bound to the land and the obligations of their lord. Yet markets, fairs, and pilgrimages occasionally pulled them beyond their villages. Journeys were made on foot or by cart, while wealthier travelers rode horses. Roads were rough, often little more than muddy tracks, and bandits or wild animals made travel risky. Bridges and ferries were controlled by tolls, adding another burden. Inns existed along busier routes, offering food and straw beds. But most travelers relied on the hospitality of monasteries or local households. Markets formed the beating heart of medieval towns and even rural villages. Weekly markets gathered farmers, artisans, and merchants, where goods from surrounding regions exchanged hands. Here peasants sold surplus eggs, cheese, or vegetables. While buying salt, iron tools, or cloth, they could not produce themselves. Fairs, held annually or seasonally, attracted merchants from far and wide, filling towns with color and noise. Spices from the east, furs from the north, and fine cloth from Flanders transformed these fairs into windows onto a wider world, even for those who rarely left their homes. Interactions between villages were shaped by both cooperation and rivalry. Families often intermarried between neighboring communities, strengthening ties and ensuring survival in hard times. Labor might be shared during harvests or building projects, with entire villages gathering to raise a barn or repair a road. Yet disputes over land boundaries, grazing rights, or water sources could quickly flare into conflict, sometimes settled by local courts, sometimes by long-standing grudges. In this way, medieval rural life was both communal and fragile, bound by necessity and strained by scarcity. Seasonal rhythms dictated not only work, but also social gatherings. Spring planting was followed by May celebrations, with flowers, dancing, and games symbolizing renewal. Summer demanded constant vigilance over crops and livestock. But midsummer festivals offered brief respite with bonfires and feasting. Autumn harvest was the busiest and most crucial season, celebrated with Thanksgiving meals and fairs once the grain was safely stored. Winter was hardest, work slowed, food was rationed, and long evenings were filled with storytelling, spinning, and mending. Survival depended on the delicate balance between seasons, faith, and fortune. Communication beyond the local level was slow and uncertain. Official messages from kings, bishops, or lords traveled by mounted couriers, sealed with wax, and carried by hand. Town criers announced news aloud in marketplaces, while priests relayed information during Sunday services. Rumors and tales spread along the routes of merchants, minstrels, and pilgrims, carrying distant stories into even the most isolated villages. For the majority, news was received communally, discussed by the hearth, and woven into the shared memory of the community. Art and expression reflected the deeply rooted faith of the time, but also the creativity of ordinary people. Churches and cathedrals displayed stained glass, frescoes, and carved stone that told biblical stories to those who could not read. Peasants decorated their homes with woven patterns, wooden carvings, and embroidered clothing, modest yet meaningful. Music, poetry, and oral storytelling remained the most accessible art forms, shared around fires or at village feasts. Even small charms or tokens carved from bone or wood reflected both superstition and a desire to leave a mark on the world. Festivities often blurred the line between sacred and secular. Carnival, held before Lent, was marked by feasting, costumes, and games, providing an outlet before the solemnity of fasting. Harvest suppers mixed gratitude with revelry, where ale flowed freely and songs echoed into the night. Saints' days gave opportunities for processions, plays, and community feasts, each blending devotion with social joy. These gatherings reminded people that life, though hard, held moments of laughter, color, and unity. Childbirth was both a hope and a danger in medieval life. Midwives, often women with generations of practical knowledge, guided mothers through labor using herbal remedies, prayers, and experience. Survival was never guaranteed. Many women and infants were lost to complications. Baptism followed swiftly, sometimes within hours. As infant mortality was high and families sought to secure the child's soul, cradle songs, charms, and saints' blessings offered comfort. And the arrival of a healthy baby was celebrated not with grandeur, but with deep relief. Health during plagues and epidemics shaped community memory for centuries. The most infamous was the Black Death of the 14th century, which wiped out vast portions of Europe's population. But even before and after that catastrophe, villages endured outbreaks of smallpox, measles, or dysentery. Local healers prescribed herbal tonics, amulets, and strict fasts, while priests organized processions and prayers. Quarantine practices slowly emerged, though often too late. These experiences etched fear into the collective imagination, but also reinforced the reliance on both faith and practical remedies. Gender roles structured everyday expectations. Men labored in the fields, served in militias, or apprenticed in crafts. Women's work was equally demanding, tending livestock, brewing ale, baking bread, spinning wool, raising children, and managing the household. In noble households, women might oversee estates, arrange marriages, or serve as patrons of art and learning. Though opportunities were limited, women held vital influence in sustaining both family and community life. Widows in particular often managed property, bridging roles usually reserved for men. Interactions between peasants and nobles were woven into the fabric of society. Peasants owed rent, taxes, and labor to their lords, but these obligations were not only economic, they were visible in daily encounters. Peasants might present a portion of their harvest to the manor, repair roads at the lord's command, or serve as laborers during castle building. In return, lords provided protection, settled disputes, and maintained order. Though inequality was stark, the relationship was not entirely distant. Peasants witnessed their lords at festivals, in church, or when justice was dispensed, and the manor house remained a tangible symbol of authority in village life. Children grew into these roles from an early age. Boys began working in the fields as soon as they were strong enough, while girls learned household skills beside their mothers. Childhood, as understood today, was brief. Play existed with simple toys carved from wood, or games of tag and ball on the village green, but it was always accompanied by the steady training for adult responsibility. Rites of passage, whether confirmation in church or apprenticeship in a trade, marked the movement from youth to maturity. Rituals of the household connected family and faith. Meals began with prayers, and seasonal blessings marked planting, harvest, and childbirth. Charms were hung above doorways to ward off evil, while candles lit before saints' images offered protection and gratitude. Weddings were community events, binding not only to individuals, but entire families. Funerals echoed through villages with bells, prayers, and shared meals, reinforcing both loss and solidarity. Animals lived side by side with humans in many peasant homes. Pigs, chickens, goats, or sheep were often kept within the same structure, providing warmth and constant noise. Cattle, essential for plowing and milk, represented wealth and survival. Care for animals required daily attention, feeding, milking, cleaning, but also forged bonds. As creatures were integral to the rhythm of medieval existence, famines were among the greatest fears of medieval people. A poor harvest, flooding, or war could mean empty granaries and desperate choices. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, rains ruined crops for consecutive years, leading to starvation across Europe. Peasants stretched what little food they had, mixing barley or oats with ground beans and weeds to bake rough bread. Some were forced to eat acorns or boiled bark. Tales of theft, wandering beggars, and weakened communities circulated long afterward, leaving an enduring scar on the memory of medieval villages. Clothing revealed not only status, but also survival. Peasants wore tunics of coarse wool or linen, patched and mended repeatedly. In colder months, layers of wool cloaks and hoods were essential, while shoes were often simple leather tied with strips. Nobles, by contrast, displayed wealth through fur linings, bright dyed fabrics like scarlet or indigo, and jewelry. Sumptuary laws attempted to restrict what peasants could wear, preserving visual distinctions between classes. Yet, in practice, villagers often found creative ways to add color with herbs and roots used as natural dyes. Personal possessions were modest for most. A wooden chest might hold a family's clothing, tools, and small heirlooms. Pottery jugs, iron cooking pots, and a few wooden spoons or bowls completed the kitchen. Textiles were precious. A blanket or a good wool cloak might be passed down through generations. Nobles and wealthy merchants, in contrast, kept illuminated manuscripts, silverware, decorated goblets, or carved furniture. Still, for both rich and poor, possessions carried symbolic weight. A wedding ring, a rosary, or even a well-made knife represented identity, continuity, and security. Superstitions threaded through the fabric of daily life. Villagers feared witches, ill omens, and curses. Charms of iron or herbs were kept near doorways to ward off spirits. Crossroads were considered dangerous places, associated with restless souls. Dreams, too, were thought to carry messages. A dream of fire might foretell conflict, while one of water could hint at fertility or disaster. In times of sickness, amulets and whispered blessings were as important as any herbal remedy. Reflecting the medieval blend of faith and folklore, seasonal rhythms dictated everything. Spring was the time for plowing, planting, and festivals celebrating renewal. Summer demanded relentless labor in the fields, long hours under the sun, and communal work during haymaking. Autumn was the harvest, a period of both anxiety and relief. With villages gathering together to secure grain, grapes, and apples, winter was the season of scarcity, when food had to be rationed, fires kept low to save fuel, and evenings were spent in storytelling, mending, and preparation for the year ahead. These cycles created not just work, but meaning, binding communities to the natural world in a rhythm that felt both eternal and fragile. Justice in the Middle Ages was rarely abstract. It was immediate, physical, and often harsh. Local lords or manorial courts dealt with small disputes, trespassing animals, stolen firewood, or unpaid rents. Punishments could be fines, stocks, or public shaming. For more serious crimes, royal or church courts stepped in. Theft might result in hanging. Blasphemy or heresy could bring burning at the stake. Ordeals were sometimes used, plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron, with survival interpreted as divine proof of innocence. Though brutal, these systems reflected a world where law and religion were inseparable. Music accompanied both work and worship. Peasants sang ballads while reaping fields, their rhythms keeping the scythe steady. Minstrels carried tales from village to village, reciting epics of heroes and saints. The church filled the calendar with chants and hymns, shaping both sacred and communal identity. Instruments like the lute, hurdy-gurdy, and bagpipes were common, often homemade. Though peasants lacked fine instruments, their music was a powerful form of memory, transmitting stories, moral lessons, and humor across generations. Leisure, though scarce, was vital. Festivals tied to the church calendar provided much-needed relief from labor. Midsummer fires, harvest feasts, and saints' days were occasions for dancing, wrestling, and games. Children played with carved wooden dolls, hoops, or knucklebones. Adults gambled with dice or chess pieces. Tournaments, when hosted by nobles, dazzled onlookers with jousts and pageantry, though peasants mostly watched from the margins. Despite poverty and hardship, laughter and play thrived, offering balance to toil and fear. Storytelling was another leisure form deeply embedded in daily life. On winter evenings, families and neighbors gathered near the hearth to hear tales of giants, saints, and legendary kings. These stories wove together history, faith, and imagination, reinforcing communal identity. Wandering bards enriched this oral culture, bringing new narratives of distant wars or exotic lands, expanding horizons beyond the narrow boundaries of the village. Through these dimensions, law, music, games, Story's daily life in the Middle Ages unfolded as more than simple survival. It was a mixture of severity and joy, of rules and celebrations, of hardship and creativity. Every villager, whether lord or serf, carried a place in this intricate tapestry of existence. Housing in the Middle Ages was as varied as the people who lived within it. Peasants typically occupied small timber-framed cottages, their walls stuffed with wattle and daub and roofs thatched with straw or reeds. Smoke from the central hearth drifted out through holes in the roof, leaving ceilings darkened with soot. Floors were often bare earth, strewn with rushes that absorbed dirt and were periodically replaced. Furniture was sparse: a rough table, a few stools, and perhaps a shared straw mattress. In contrast, nobles lived in stone manors or castles with multiple chambers, now tapestries for insulation, and larger hearths to provide warmth. Yet even in grand halls, drafts crept in, and heating remained uneven. Travel for the average medieval person was rare, but not impossible. Peasants rarely strayed beyond a day's walk from their village, yet markets, fairs, and pilgrimages created opportunities for movement. Roads were muddy tracks, often dangerous and plagued with bandits. Bridges were scarce, forcing travelers to ford rivers or rely on ferrymen. Carts creaked along uneven ground while those with means rode on horseback. Long journeys demanded provisions, making inns and monasteries important stopping places. Travel was not simply physical movement. It meant exposure to new dialects, customs, and goods, widening the worldview of even humble peasants. Markets pulsed with life and color, forming the commercial heartbeat of medieval society. On market days, villagers crowded into town squares with baskets of eggs, cheese, wool, or vegetables. The air carried smells of roasting meat, leatherwork, and spices. Haggling was expected, and coinage circulated alongside barter. Fairs, often linked to religious festivals, brought merchants from far regions, offering salt, iron tools, wine, and cloth. These gatherings were more than economic exchanges. They were social events, where news spread, marriages were arranged, and gossip flourished. Trade connected the local to the global. While peasants dealt in subsistence goods, townsmen and merchants engaged in larger networks, stretching across Europe and beyond. Wool from England, wine from France, and furs from the Baltic passed through bustling centers. The Hanseatic League dominated northern trade routes, while Mediterranean ports like Venice and Genoa handled goods from the east, silk, spices, and precious metals. Even those who never left their village felt the influence of these networks. As foreign goods slowly trickled down, changing diets, clothing, and tools, the rhythm of daily life was thus not isolated but connected. Cottages tied to fields, villages tied to towns, towns tied to continents. In this web of houses, roads, markets, and trade routes, medieval people lived lives both intensely local and surprisingly global. As we leave behind the cottages, the muddy roads, and the bustling markets of the medieval world, we begin to see how every thread of daily life was tied to something larger. Food, housing, and trade were not just practical needs, but reflections of the social order that governed the entire Middle Ages. A peasant's modest home, a merchant's journey, or noble's feast, all these details were shaped by a deeper framework of power and obligation. To truly understand the daily experience of medieval people, we must now step beyond the routines of cooking and markets and look at the structure that defined who worked the land, who gave orders, and who followed them. This was the feudal system, the backbone of medieval Europe, which dictated a person's duties, privileges, and even their sense of identity. And so, with the sounds of the village fading into the background, let us quietly turn to where we will explore the peasant's position under their lord, and how the vast machinery of feudalism shaped their everyday lives. In the Middle Ages, daily life was not lived in isolation. Every man, woman, and child belonged to a structure that reached from the lowest fields up to the mightiest throne. This was the feudal system, a network of loyalties and obligations that held medieval Europe together for centuries. At the top stood the monarch, the king or queen, who technically owned all the land. Beneath them were the great nobles, lords and ladies, who received vast estates in exchange for loyalty and military support. Below the lords were the knights, men trained for war, who pledged their swords to defend their lord's lands. And at the very base of this pyramid stood the peasants, the majority of the population, who worked the soil that sustained everyone else. For a peasant, life under feudalism meant belonging not only to the land, but also to the lord who controlled it. Many peasants were serfs, bound by law and custom to remain on the estate where they were born. They could not freely leave, nor could they own the fields they cultivated. Their duty was to provide labor, rent, or a portion of their harvest in return for protection and the right to live on the land. This relationship was often described in terms of mutual obligation. The lord offered safety, especially during a time when raids, wars, and banditry were common. The peasants, in turn, gave their labor. But the balance was not equal. The lord's protection could be distant or ineffective, while the demands on peasants were constant and unrelenting. To imagine it, picture a manor, a cluster of peasant cottages, small plots of farmland, perhaps a mill by a stream, and overlooking it all, the manor house where the lord resided. Every detail of life, from when to plant crops, to when to gather wood, to how much grain must be given as rent, was tied to the authority of the lord and his officials. And yet, despite its rigidness, the system was not entirely without room for negotiation. Some peasants could strike better terms or even gain modest freedoms by paying their way out of certain obligations. Others, especially in regions where labor was scarce, found ways to improve their lot. But for most, the feudal contract bound their lives as firmly as the walls of the manor surrounded the lord's hall. To live as a peasant in the Middle Ages was to live under a constant rhythm of duties and obligations. The manor was not just a piece of land. It was a complete economic unit, and every family within it played a part in sustaining it. Peasants owed their lord rent, sometimes in coin, though more often in kind. That meant giving up a portion of their grain, eggs, wool, or livestock as payment for the right to work their plots. Even if a harvest failed, these dues were still expected, which could plunge families into hardship. Beyond rent, there were labor services. A peasant might spend several days each week working the lord's domain, the fields set aside exclusively for the lord's household. This was labor taken from their own time, meaning they had fewer hours to till their personal plots. The domain might involve plowing, sowing, weeding, or harvesting, depending on the season. Other tasks could be demanded as well. Peasants were often required to maintain roads, repair fences, or transport loads of firewood or stone. If the manor included a mill or an oven, peasants were obliged to use it and pay a fee for the privilege. Grinding grain at the lord's mill or baking bread in the communal oven was rarely optional, and the fees charged could be heavy. In addition to these everyday obligations, there were special dues. When the lord's daughter married, or when his eldest son was knighted, peasants were expected to contribute gifts or money. If the lord was captured in war and needed ransom, his tenants were called upon to help raise the sum. These obligations, rooted in custom, reinforced the sense that peasants' lives were tied to their lord's fortune in both good times and bad. Justice, too, was part of manorial life. The lord or his appointed steward held court, where disputes among peasants were settled and fines were imposed. A broken fence, a straying pig, or an accusation of theft could all bring a family before the manorial court. Fines might seem small individually, but they added up over time, further draining the modest resources of a household. For many peasants, survival required not only hard work, but also careful navigation of these obligations. Families who fell behind on their dues risked losing their rights to the land or facing punishment. Yet most accepted these conditions as the fabric of life, passed down from one generation to the next. And still, within this demanding system, peasants found ways to maintain a rhythm of community. Shared labor, seasonal festivals, and even the collective burdens of manorial duties created bonds among neighbors. Though tied to their lord, peasants often relied more on each other to endure the challenges of feudal life. If the lord governed a peasant's worldly duties, the church governed their spiritual ones. In the medieval world, faith was not a private matter, but a public and communal framework that touched nearly every aspect of life. Peasants were required to pay the tithe, a tax amounting to roughly 1/10 of their annual produce or income. This might be grain, livestock, wool, or even labor, depending on what a household could offer. The tithe supported the local parish priest, maintained the church building, and contributed to the larger wealth of the church itself. Though it was framed as a sacred duty for struggling families, it could feel as heavy as the rents owed to the manor. The church calendar structured the year. Sundays and holy days meant rest from labor, but also attendance at Mass, where sermons reminded peasants of their duties to God, to their neighbors, and to their lords. Festivals for saints' days brought moments of color and joy, processions, feasts, and sometimes games, which contrasted with the steady grind of agricultural toil. Rites of passage also drew peasants into the church's orbit. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals all required the blessing of a priest, often with accompanying fees. These ceremonies reinforced the idea that life itself, from birth to death, belonged under the care of the church. For peasants, religion was not only obligation, but also comfort. In a world of disease, famine, and uncertainty, prayers, relics, and pilgrimages offered hope. Candles lit before statues of saints, charms against illness, processions to holy wells or shrines gave a sense of protection against forces they could not control. The church also served as a keeper of knowledge and memory. Priests often read out royal decrees, announced feast days, and marked the passing of seasons. For many peasants who could not read or write, the church was their window into the wider world beyond the manor. Yet, as with lords, the church could also exploit its position. Indulgences, additional fees, or demands for labor on church lands added to a peasant's burdens. Resentment sometimes simmered quietly, though most accepted these obligations as part of divine order. Questioning the church openly was rare and dangerous, as heresy could mean exile, punishment, or even death. Still, the presence of the church softened life in certain ways. Its festivals gave respite, its teachings offered meaning, and its community brought people together in rituals that bound villages into shared experience. While the word peasant is often used broadly in the Middle Ages, it described a spectrum of conditions. At one end stood the serfs, bound to the soil and unable to leave without their lord's permission. At the other were the free peasants, who enjoyed greater rights though still lived within the structure of feudalism. Serfs were the backbone of manorial labor. They worked the lord's land, paid rents in kind, and performed services without choice. Legally, they were tied to the estate. If the land was sold or inherited, the serfs remained with it, just as fields and barns did. Though they were not slaves, they could not usually be bought or sold individually. Their freedom was sharply limited. Serfs required the lord's consent for major life decisions. Marrying someone outside the manor, moving to another village, passing land to their children, often required approval and sometimes additional payment. Their daily reality was one of obligation, with little chance to alter their station. Free peasants, by contrast, held a more flexible position. They typically paid rent for their plots in money or produce, but they were not bound to remain on a particular manor. A free peasant could, in theory, move elsewhere, negotiate new terms, or even seek better opportunities in towns. Some owned small portions of land outright, giving them a degree of independence rare among their serf neighbors. This distinction mattered deeply. Free peasants had more bargaining power and sometimes better living conditions, though they still faced the same risks of famine, disease, and taxation. In times of labor shortage, such as after the Black Death in the 14th century, free peasants could command higher wages, while serfs found new opportunities to push against the limits of their bondage. Between these two groups, there were also cotters and boarders, peasants with only a cottage and perhaps a strip of land, whose survival depended on hiring themselves out as laborers. They ranked even lower in security, often living at the mercy of both the lord and the wealthier peasants of the village. The social divisions within the peasantry remind us that medieval daily life was never entirely uniform. Obligations, freedoms, and hardships varied, but all were tied together under the broader weight of the feudal system. While peasants were not knights, the shadow of warfare hung constantly over their lives. Medieval Europe was a landscape of frequent conflicts, local feuds between lords, territorial disputes, or larger wars between kingdoms. Whenever armies marched, it was peasants who bore much of the cost. Lords owed military service to their king, and knights provided the armed force. But peasants were expected to support these efforts indirectly. They supplied food, carts, horses, and labor for transporting weapons or building fortifications. In some cases, peasants were conscripted into militias, armed with little more than spears, bows, or farm tools, to defend their lord's lands. War often brought devastation to the countryside. Fields were trampled by marching soldiers, livestock seized to feed armies, and villages burned in raids. Peasants had no choice but to abandon crops and flee into forests or fortified towns, leaving behind the work of months. A single campaign season could undo years of toil. Beyond the immediate destruction, warfare increased taxes. Kings and lords demanded extra levies to fund campaigns, placing additional burdens on already strained households. When conflicts dragged on, peasants found themselves squeezed between the need to provide food for armies and the struggle to feed their own families. The emotional toll was also significant. Fear of raiding parties, the uncertainty of harvests lost, and the instability of shifting borders weighed heavily on rural communities. Yet peasants were remarkably resilient. When the fighting ended, they returned to their ruined fields, repaired cottages, and began again, restoring the rhythms of village life as best they could. In times of prolonged conflict, however, some peasants sought alternatives. A few left the countryside altogether, migrating to towns and cities where they might find work as laborers or artisans. Others turned to the church for refuge, becoming lay brothers, servants, or workers in monasteries, trading agricultural toil for a different kind of dependency. Wars, then, were not distant affairs fought only by kings and knights. They seeped into the very soil of the peasants' field, shaping their survival and reminding them that their place in the feudal system was tied not just to their lord, but to the shifting fortunes of an entire realm. The manor was more than a place to live. It was an economic system designed to be largely self-sufficient. Yet within this system, peasants played vital roles in producing, processing, and exchanging the goods that kept medieval society functioning. Central to manorial life were the lord's monopolies, certain facilities that all peasants were obliged to use, often for a fee. The mill was one of the most important. Peasants brought their grain to be ground into flour, paying either a portion of the grain itself or money for the service. Attempts to grind grain at home were discouraged, sometimes even forbidden, since it denied the lord his due profit. The oven was another monopoly. Bread was the staple food of medieval Europe, and peasants usually had to bake it in the communal oven, again paying a fee. Even the simplest necessities of life were thus tied to the lord's economic power. Beyond the manor, peasants also took part in local markets. Weekly or seasonal markets allowed them to trade surplus produce, dairy, eggs, or small crafts in exchange for items they could not produce themselves, such as salt, iron tools, or cloth. Fairs held annually or on special feast days brought larger gatherings, drawing merchants from towns and even distant regions. These events were not only economic opportunities but also social occasions, moments when villagers glimpsed a wider world beyond their fields. Trade networks gradually linked even remote peasants to broader patterns of commerce. A peasant selling a few sacks of grain in a local market might be contributing, unknowingly, to a chain of exchange that stretched across kingdoms. Wool from sheep grazed on village pastures could find its way into the booming textile industry of Flanders or England. While surplus wine or grain moved toward towns where demand was high, money itself became increasingly important over time. In earlier centuries, many rents and dues were paid in kind, crops, animals, or services. But as coinage spread, lords began to demand payments in money, pushing peasants to sell more of their produce in markets. This shift tied rural life more closely to regional economies and exposed peasants to fluctuations in prices and trade. Still, the manor remained the anchor. For most peasants, markets were supplementary. The bulk of their work went into sustaining their households and fulfilling obligations to the Lord. The manor economy was designed to keep wealth flowing upward. Even as peasants sought small ways to use markets for their own benefit, life within the manor was not only about farming and labor, it was also bound by a strict legal framework. At the center of this system stood the manorial court, a local institution where disputes were settled, obligations enforced, and community rules maintained. The manorial court was usually presided over by the Lord's steward or bailiff, who represented the Lord's interests. Peasants were required to attend these sessions, which might be held several times a year. Attendance was not optional. Failure to appear could result in fines, reinforcing the authority of the Lord's justice. The court dealt with a wide range of issues. Land transfers, inheritance disputes, and breaches of contract were common matters. So too were agricultural regulations, when fields were to be plowed, when animals could graze on common pasture, or how hedges and ditches were to be maintained. Even small offenses, such as letting animals wander into another's crops, were subject to fines. There was also a moral and social dimension to the court. Drunkenness, fighting, or breaking the peace of the village could be punished. Illicit brewing or baking outside the Lord's monopolies was treated as a serious violation, since it undermined his revenues. The court thus regulated both the economic and social fabric of peasant life. Justice was usually collective rather than individual. A village community might be fined as a whole if its boundaries were poorly maintained, or if it failed to present offenders for judgment. This practice reinforced mutual responsibility among neighbors, though it also bred tensions, since one person's carelessness could impose burdens on many. Punishments were often financial. Fines in money or kind were the most common penalties, since they provided income for the Lord. Imprisonment was rare in rural settings, as manors lacked proper facilities. Instead, shame and economic pressure were the tools of control. In some cases, repeat offenders could face expulsion from the community, a devastating outcome in a world where survival depended on access to land. These courts, though restrictive, also offered peasants a measure of recourse. Disputes between neighbors over property lines, debts, or insults could be formally resolved. In this way, the manorial court functioned not only as an arm of lordly power, but also as a mediator of village life, embedding legal order into the rhythms of daily existence. Beyond obligations to the Lord, peasants lived within tightly knit village communities that functioned as a second layer of authority and identity. These communities operated on cooperation as much as necessity. Farming, particularly in the open field system, demanded coordinated effort. Peasants had to plow, sow, and harvest their strips in rhythm with their neighbors. For the fields were divided, but not fenced. One household's delay could hinder the work of many. Cooperation extended into everyday needs. Building a new cottage or repairing a thatched roof often called for neighbors to lend a hand. And in return, the favor would be repaid. Tools were shared, oxen were lent, and harvests were brought in with collective labor. The rhythm of village life was thus built on reciprocity and unwritten expectations of solidarity. But alongside cooperation existed conflict. Disputes over boundaries, accusations of theft, or quarrels over grazing rights could fracture harmony. These tensions often appeared before the manorial court. Yet they were also addressed informally, through negotiation, gossip, or the quiet intervention of elders. The social calendar of peasants was shaped by festivals and feast days. The medieval church marked time not only with Sunday Mass, but with a series of saints, days and religious celebrations that punctuated the year. These occasions, often linked to agricultural cycles, brought relief from work and opportunities for merriment. Villagers might gather for games, music, or communal meals, blending sacred ritual with social enjoyment. Religion penetrated all aspects of daily life. Peasants began and ended their days with prayer, and the church provided both spiritual guidance and a framework of discipline. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals were overseen by clergy, anchoring the life cycle to religious ritual. Obligations, such as tithes, the payment of a tenth of produce to the parish, tied the economic life of the village directly to the church. The parish church itself stood as the symbolic and literal center of the community. Often modest in design, with stone walls and a wooden roof, it was nevertheless the most enduring structure in many villages. Within, murals or carvings conveyed biblical stories to a largely illiterate population. Bells rang out to mark the hours, calling peasants to prayer, to labor, or to assembly. Religion also influenced perceptions of time and labor. Certain days were forbidden for work, and agricultural tasks had to be adjusted to the rhythm of feast and fast. This structure provided peasants with a balance between toil and rest, though it also reinforced the authority of church and lord alike. Through these networks of cooperation, celebration, and faith, the medieval village became more than a collection of farms. It was a self-contained world, bound by necessity, custom, belief, a world in which daily life unfolded with remarkable stability. Even under the pressures of obligation and hardship, life for a medieval peasant was measured less by clocks or calendars than by the turn of the seasons. Each phase of the year brought its own duties, anxieties, and rituals, shaping the pace of village life. Spring signaled renewal, but demanded intense labor. As soon as the frosts lifted, fields were prepared for planting. Oxen plowed furrows, men sowed seed, and women followed behind, covering grain with harrows made from bundles of branches. It was a season of hope, but also of hunger. Winter stores often dwindled by early spring, creating what historians call the hungry gap. Peasants sometimes subsisted on coarse bread, thin pottage, or foraged greens, while they waited for new crops to grow. Summer brought long days of exhausting work. Weeds had to be pulled from the fields, meadows were cut for hay, and animals were driven to common pastures. Children often guarded cattle and geese, learning responsibility from a young age. Though labor was heavy, summer also offered moments of relative abundance. As berries ripened, herbs flourished, and gardens produced vegetables. Autumn was the most critical time, the harvest season. Every hand was needed in the fields. Neighbors worked together to bring in grain before rain spoiled it, while gleaners, often the poor or widowed, collected leftover stalks after reaping. Cider and ale were brewed, apples dried, and nuts gathered for winter. The success or failure of this season determined survival in the months ahead. Winter slowed agricultural labor but brought no true rest. Firewood had to be gathered, animals needed fodder, and tools repaired. Spinning, weaving, and mending took place by the hearth, keeping hands busy while nights stretched long. Villagers gathered for storytelling or communal tasks, reinforcing bonds during the cold and dark. The cycle of seasons was not just practical but deeply symbolic. Religious festivals often aligned with agricultural milestones. Easter coincided with spring planting. Lammas marked the first loaves baked from the new harvest, and Christmas arrived as the year paused in winter stillness. In this way, faith and farming intertwined, giving rhythm and meaning to the hardships of survival. Life's unpredictability was always near. Drought, storms, or disease could upset the fragile balance. Yet peasants adapted through experience, local wisdom, and mutual aid, trusting that the seasons, though harsh, would turn again. A medieval peasant's home was often small, simple, and built with whatever materials were available locally. In forested regions, walls might be wattle and daub, woven wooden strips smeared with mud and straw. In stone-rich areas, rough blocks formed sturdier walls, though only a few peasants could afford them. Thatched roofs of reeds or straws sloped steeply to shed rain, but they were prone to rot, leaks, and even fire. Inside, smoke from the hearth curled upward and escaped through a hole in the roof, staining timbers black. Windows were rare, and when present, filled with oiled cloth or wooden shutters instead of glass. Floors were usually packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or herbs to freshen the air and absorb dirt. Furniture was sparse, a heavy table, a bench, perhaps a chest for storage. Beds might be nothing more than a wooden frame stuffed with straw or hay, shared by the whole family. Livestock were often kept indoors at night, especially in winter, their warmth helping heat the dwelling. While such conditions sound harsh today, they represented security to peasants, a a space of shelter in a precarious world. Clothing was equally practical. Most garments were made from coarse wool or homespun linen. Men wore tunics belted at the waist, with hose or leggings beneath. Women wore long gowns with aprons, their heads covered by wimples or kerchiefs. Children often wore smaller versions of adult clothing, hand-me-downs, patched repeatedly. Colors were usually muted: browns, grays, and dull greens, though vegetable dyes could add hints of blue from woad, yellow from weld, or red from madder. Shoes were basic leather turn shoes, fragile in wet conditions. So many peasants simply went barefoot, especially in summer. Possessions were few but valued: a pot for cooking, a knife for cutting, perhaps a wooden spoon or bowl for each family member. Textiles like blankets and cloaks were treasured because they took so long to make. When a peasant acquired a metal tool, a sickle, axe, or plowshare, it was carefully maintained, sometimes even passed down for generations. The scarcity of goods meant that nothing was wasted. Worn garments were mended, tools repaired, and broken pottery recycled as drainage in floors or gardens. These modest surroundings shaped both daily labor and imagination. Stories, songs, and rituals often referenced the hearth, the loom, or the plow because they were the most familiar features of life. The material poverty of peasants contrasted sharply with the wealth of nobles. Yet within their own world, these objects were sufficient to sustain both body and spirit. The diet of medieval peasants was plain, repetitive, and tied closely to the agricultural cycle. Bread formed its cornerstone. Most peasants ate coarse loaves, baked from rye, barley, or oats. Since fine white wheat bread was reserved for wealthier households, bread was dense, dark, and sometimes gritty, since flour might be adulterated with chaff or ground with stones from the mill. To accompany bread came pottage, a thick, stew-like dish of grains simmered with vegetables, herbs, and occasionally beans or peas. Pottage could be thin or hearty, depending on what was available. During harvest times, it might be rich with onions, leeks, cabbages, or turnips. In leaner months, it could be little more than boiled grains. Meat was rare for ordinary peasants. Hunting was forbidden by law in most forests, reserved for lords and nobles. Peasants might eat pork from a pig raised in their yard, or a chicken from their flock. But such animals were more valuable alive for producing offspring, eggs, or milk. Therefore, slaughter usually occurred only during festivals or when animals grew too old to be useful. Preserved meats, salted pork, dried fish, or smoked bacon were more common than fresh ones. Fish was central, especially because the church mandated many days of fasting when meat could not be eaten. Rivers and streams provided eels, carp, and trout, while coastal areas supplied herring or cod. Monasteries and lords often controlled fishing rights. But peasants still managed to gather shellfish, net small catches, or trade for dried fish. Dairy products, though, were daily staples. Milk was often too perishable to drink fresh, so it was churned into butter or made into soft cheeses. These not only provided protein and fat, but also kept longer than milk itself. To flavor their meals, peasants relied on herbs grown in gardens: parsley, sage, thyme, or dill. Imported spices like pepper, cinnamon, or saffron were luxuries far beyond their reach. Instead, they used onions, garlic, and mustard seeds for stronger taste. As for drinks, water was not always safe, so ale, a weak beer brewed from barley, was the most common beverage. It was nourishing, relatively safe, and consumed by both adults and children. Cider appeared in apple-growing regions, while wine remained largely the preserve of nobles, except in southern areas where vineyards thrived. In times of scarcity, diets could become painfully meager. Famines struck when harvests failed, leaving peasants with only thin gruel, foraged plants, or even bark and acorns ground into flour substitutes. Malnutrition was a constant threat, and the memory of bad harvests lingered for generations. Yet meals also had a social dimension. Families gathered around the hearth to share their food, however humble, and neighbors might exchange goods in times of need. Festivals and feast days, when lords provided extra meat or ale, became moments of rare abundance, reinforcing community bonds. Life in the Middle Ages was often short, and peasants faced a wide array of illnesses without the benefit of modern science. Common ailments included fevers, stomach troubles, infections from wounds, and seasonal diseases brought on by poor harvests or contaminated food. Childhood mortality was especially high. Many children never reached adulthood, leaving families to endure constant grief alongside daily labor. Medical theory in the medieval world was shaped by the ancient idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Balance among these fluids was thought to determine health. Peasants rarely studied such theories themselves, but they lived in a culture where remedies often aimed to restore balance, whether through bloodletting, herbal tonics, or purging. Professional doctors were expensive and mostly accessible only to nobles and wealthy townsfolk. For peasants, local healers, wise women, and midwives played the central role in healthcare. These figures drew on herbal knowledge, experience, and tradition. Remedies might include teas made from chamomile for sleep, mint for digestion, or willow bark for pain. Garlic was prized for its supposed power to cleanse the blood, while honey was used to soothe wounds and infections. Superstition and faith intertwined with medicine. Charms were sometimes worn to ward off illness, and prayers to saints were believed to help recovery. In times of plague or epidemic, processions, fasts, pilgrimages were organized, as disease was seen as both a physical and spiritual trial. Midwives were essential figures in village life. They assisted in childbirth, offering both practical aid and reassurance. Since many births carried high risks, midwives relied on herbal concoctions to ease pain, rituals for protection, and close observation learned over years of experience. Sanitation was a constant challenge. Cottages often lacked chimneys or ventilation, animals shared living spaces, and waste disposal was crude. Water sources could be easily contaminated, leading to outbreaks of dysentery or worse. Simple practices like boiling water or washing hands were not widely understood as protective. Instead, health was tied to fortune, divine will, or the natural order. When disease spread widely, entire communities could be devastated. The Great Famine of the early 14th century and later, the Black Death left marks not only on population, but also on collective memory. Yet in ordinary times, peasants leaned on resilience, neighborly support, and centuries of inherited knowledge. What is striking is the mixture of practical observation, noticing which herbs worked or which foods eased illness, alongside deeply symbolic beliefs rooted in religion and folklore. For peasants, health was never just physical. It was part of the spiritual and communal fabric of life. The rhythm of a peasant's year was set not by clocks, but by the sun, the seasons, and the demands of agriculture. Each month brought new tasks, and the survival of the household depended on following this unrelenting cycle. In spring, the soil was turned with heavy wooden plows tipped with iron, pulled by oxen or horses, if a family was fortunate. Poorer peasants might use only spades and hoes, working slowly to prepare their small strips of land. Seed sowing required careful timing. Too early and frost might kill the shoots. Too late and the harvest would be poor. Summer brought long hours of labor. Weeds had to be pulled, meadows scythed for hay, and animals driven to pastures. The work began at dawn and stretched late into the evening. Scythes, sickles, and rakes were the main tools, their edges sharpened with whetstones carried at the waist. Autumn was the season of harvest. Men and women together worked the fields, cutting grain stalks with sickles, binding sheaves and stacking them for threshing. Threshing itself was done with flails, wooden rods connected by leather hinges, which beat the grain loose from the husks. Winnowing followed, tossing grain in the air so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff. Winter slowed the pace, but brought its own burdens. Animals required feeding from the stores of hay, and firewood had to be chopped and carted. Peasants repaired tools, patched clothing, and mended roofs against the storms. Women spun wool into yarn, while men might carve wooden handles or shape small items for sale at market. Beyond the farm, some peasants practiced crafts. A village might have a blacksmith, a miller, or a carpenter. These figures were vital, as they provided iron plowshares, sharpened blades, ground grain, or built carts. Even so, most peasants were expected to know at least basic repair skills for their own tools. Work was communal as much as individual. Neighbors often helped each other in the heaviest tasks, such as harvesting or building a house, because one family alone could not manage the labor. In return, favors were repaid in kind, weaving a web of mutual obligation that was as important as formal duties to the Lord. Time itself was marked differently. Bells from the village church announced hours for prayer and often guided the day's divisions. Yet peasants thought less in minutes and hours than in tasks: milking before sunrise, threshing until the cart was full, hay cutting until the meadow was cleared. Their lives moved not by ticking clocks, but by work completed season by season. These rhythms, repetitive, exhausting, but also deeply ingrained, gave structure to medieval life. Each tool, from the simplest hoe to the iron-tipped plow, was part of a larger pattern in which the land demanded obedience and labor gave meaning. Although work dominated the life of medieval peasants, the calendar was also marked by moments of rest, festivity, and shared joy. The church year shaped much of this rhythm. Holy days, from Christmas to Easter, from saints' feasts to local parish festivals, provided sanctioned breaks from labor. On these days, fields were left untended, and people gathered for worship, processions, and communal meals. Harvest festivals were among the most anticipated. After the hard toil of summer and autumn, villagers joined in Thanksgiving ceremonies. Bringing offerings of grain, bread, and ale to the church, the evenings might see music, dancing, and games on the village green. Such events were not only celebrations of survival, but also renewals of social bonds. Peasants found leisure in simple pastimes. Children played with homemade toys like carved wooden dolls or knucklebones. Adults enjoyed games of dice, nine men's Morris, or wrestling contests. Music came from flutes, fiddles, or simple drums, and ballads were sung around the hearth or in the tavern. Storytelling, often passed orally from generation to generation, wove together memory and imagination during long winter nights. Saints' days and pilgrimages added another layer of communal identity. Even the poorest might scrape together resources to visit a local shrine, hoping for blessings, cures, or protection. The journey itself, shared with neighbors, became a social event as much as a spiritual act. Leisure was never entirely free from duty. Many festivals also involved reaffirming obligations to the Lord or parish. Rents might be collected on feast days, or villagers reminded of their duties during gatherings. Yet for peasants, these occasions broke the monotony of labor, offering moments of laughter, music, and togetherness that gave meaning to an otherwise difficult life. And so within the web of obligations, toil, and hardship, peasants found balance. Their year was not only one of endless work, but also of punctuated joy. Moments where community and faith lightened the burden of survival, as we leave behind the broader landscape of fields, duties, and festivals. Let us now step closer into the intimate world of the peasant household. Section 3 will take us inside the cottage itself, where families slept, worked, shared meals, and passed through the stages of life. Here in the flicker of the hearth fire, we glimpse daily existence not as part of the village or manor. Entering a medieval peasant's home meant stepping into a world that was both harsh and intimate. Cottages were small, often a single room that served every purpose: cooking, eating, working, and sleeping. Smoke from the hearth curled in the air, dimming the light and clinging to clothes. The smell of earth, animals, and food blended together, creating a space that was lived in, worn, and practical. The hearth was the center of this world. A fire smoldered constantly, not only for warmth but also for cooking. Pots hung from iron hooks or rested directly on stones in the fire. A kettle might simmer with pottage, sending up the smell of boiled grains and herbs. When fuel was scarce, peat, dried dung, or small bundles of sticks replaced logs. Around the hearth, daily life unfolded. Meals were shared here, often eaten from a communal pot with wooden spoons or hands. Bread was broken and passed around, ale poured into simple mugs. This was not just nourishment, but also a ritual of togetherness, the family drawing close in the flicker of firelight. Sleeping arrangements were crowded. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents slept side by side, often on a shared straw mattress laid on the floor. In winter, blankets of wool or patched cloth were piled high, and animals might be brought inside for warmth. Privacy was almost non-existent, but the closeness reinforced family bonds. The walls of the cottage often carried tools or simple shelves, holding precious possessions, a wooden chest with clothing, a spindle for spinning, perhaps a small religious icon or cross. In some households, charms of herbs hung for protection, blending folk belief with Christian faith. Sounds filled the space, the crackle of the fire, the lowing of animals, the chatter of children, the creak of wood underfoot. On long evenings, stories were told, prayers murmured, or songs sung softly as work like spinning or mending clothes continued by firelight. Though cramped and smoky, the cottage was the center of identity and survival. It was here that children grew, elders passed on traditions, and families weathered both joy and hardship. For all its modesty, it held the essence of peasant life. Life inside a medieval cottage revolved around clearly defined roles, each family member contributing to survival and daily routine. These roles were shaped by necessity, tradition, and the rhythms of labor outside the home. Men typically handled the heaviest physical work. They plowed fields, tended large animals, chopped wood, repaired tools, and carried out seasonal duties such as sowing and harvesting. Within the cottage, they might construct furniture, mend structures, or carve utensils. Men were also responsible for representing the family in village matters, attending manorial courts, paying rents, or negotiating labor obligations with the lord. Their authority was recognized, but not absolute. Cooperation within the household was vital. Women held multiple, overlapping responsibilities. They cooked, spun, wove, and managed household storage. Tending gardens and small livestock like chickens or goats fell under their care. Women also cared for children, maintained hygiene, and treated minor ailments using herbal remedies passed down through generations. In addition to domestic work, women often participated in farm labor, especially during planting and harvest, blending household duties with economic necessity. Children contributed from an early age. Boys might herd animals, run errands, or assist in plowing during peak seasons. Girls learned cooking, spinning, and weaving, often helping their mothers with chores. Both boys and girls were gradually socialized into the expectations of adult life, learning skills essential for survival. Play was limited but important, often improvised using simple toys or found objects. Elders, grandparents, or older relatives provided guidance, wisdom, and labor where possible. They might teach children practical skills, assist in lighter work, and preserve oral history songs and family traditions. Their presence reinforced continuity within the household, connecting generations even in the midst of hardship. The household operated as a unit, balancing labor, care, and survival. Everyone's contribution was crucial. If one member fell ill, the entire family adjusted, shifting tasks and responsibilities to maintain food, warmth, and protection. Within the small cottage, the boundaries between work, education, recreation, and rest blurred. The rhythm of life was continuous, punctuated only by meals, seasonal labor, or communal gatherings outside the home. This intimate environment shaped the character and resilience of peasants. Skills, values, and knowledge were transmitted directly through daily participation, ensuring that children absorbed the ways of their world naturally, and that households could endure the cycles of labor, scarcity, and occasional celebration. A peasant household followed a rigid daily schedule, dictated by light, seasons, and necessity. The day often began before sunrise, with men heading out to fields or tending animals, while women prepared breakfast, typically a simple meal of bread, pottage, or milk. Children joined wherever possible, either helping with chores or collecting firewood and water. Meal preparation was a labor-intensive process. Grains had to be ground into flour using hand-operated querns or small village mills. Water was drawn from wells or streams, often carried in heavy wooden buckets. Herbs and vegetables were washed and chopped, and a fire kept at a constant simmer to cook pottage, soups, or stews. Large families required careful rationing. No portion could be wasted. Household management extended beyond cooking. Water and firewood had to be collected daily, and waste removed from the living space. Floors were swept, bedding adjusted, and animals cared for. Tasks were seasonal, spinning and weaving in winter, garden tending in spring. Food preservation in autumn, but all required consistent attention to maintain survival. Children often assisted in every aspect of household management, from stirring pottage to helping tend livestock. Their education was practical rather than formal, learning by observing, imitating, and participating in daily chores. Storytelling and song intertwined with work, making even the repetitive tasks more bearable. Women maintained a stock of household supplies, including flour, salted meats, dried herbs, and butter. This inventory was critical, as poor harvests or unexpected expenses could leave the family vulnerable. Careful planning ensured that staples lasted through winter and that special occasions or feast days could still be observed. The cottage itself was organized around these routines. Storage chests, shelves, and hooks held tools, clothing, and utensils within reach. Pots were hung above the hearth, bedding rolled or stacked during the day, and every item had its place. Efficiency was essential. In a small space, disorder could disrupt daily survival. Work and rest were intertwined. Evenings were spent by the fire, mending clothes, spinning wool, or sharing stories. Prayer, singing, and reflection created a rhythm that balanced labor with spiritual and emotional needs. Even in modest cottages, life had a structure, a predictability, and a sense of continuity that bound the family together. Beyond subsistence, peasant households often engaged in small-scale crafts to support themselves or participate in the local economy. These activities were interwoven with daily life, performed alongside agricultural and domestic duties. Spinning and weaving were essential. Women and older children spun wool or flax into thread, then wove it into cloth using simple looms. This cloth became clothing for the family, or could be traded at local markets for other necessities. Careful dyeing with natural plants like woad, weld, or madder added color to fabrics, though such materials were expensive and used sparingly. Toolmaking and repairs sometimes occurred at home. Simple wooden implements, like buckets, stools, or pitchforks, were carved and maintained by household members. Metal tools were repaired if possible, though forging new items often required the services of a village blacksmith. Knowledge of repair and resourcefulness was crucial, as replacing tools was costly and difficult. Peasants also engaged in food preservation for trade. Surplus grain, butter, cheese, or cured meats could be sold at markets, exchanged for goods they lacked, or gifted to neighbors to maintain social ties. Small crafts, like baskets, rope, or simple pottery, were also part of this informal economy, reflecting both creativity and necessity. Local fairs and markets played a critical role. Even the poorest family could sometimes access goods beyond what they could produce themselves. Bartering was common, a dozen eggs for a yard of cloth or a woven basket for a small amount of salt. These exchanges built networks of trust and mutual support across villages. Within the household, children were apprenticed early, learning skills by participating in these economic tasks. Boys might follow men to the mill or help prepare products for market, while girls learned spinning, weaving, and food preservation alongside their mothers. Education was practical, rooted in experience, and passed down through observation and practice. The household economy blended survival and commerce. With craft, trade, and subsistence feeding into each other, this system reinforced resilience, allowing families to weather poor harvests or unexpected hardships while maintaining their place within the village community. Even in the modest walls of a cottage, the rhythm of labor, production, and exchange created a dynamic, living environment. As the evening shadows lengthened over the village, the peasant households settled into quiet routines. The hearth glowed softly, illuminating worn floors and simple furniture. While the family completed their final tasks of the day, meals had been shared, tools put in order, and children lulled toward sleep by gentle stories and whispered songs. Life in the Middle Ages was a delicate balance of labor, care, and small joys. Every task, from tending animals to spinning thread, from preparing pottage to repairing tools, was tied to survival and to the bonds between family members. Even amid scarcity and hardship, communities found ways to celebrate, to support one another, to pass on knowledge across generations. And as we leave behind the humble cottages, the fields, and the rhythm of daily toil, take a slow breath and let the quiet of this past world settle around you. Imagine the flickering firelight, the soft murmur of conversation, and the steady passage of seasons shaping life in ways both simple and profound. Tonight, you've glimpsed the entire daily life of peasants in the Middle Ages. From the laborious fields to the intimate corners of the home, tomorrow we will explore another chapter of history, perhaps a world of noble courts, its bustling towns, or forgotten inventions, a story that promises to be just as fascinating and perfectly soothing for sleep. Let your mind drift gently, and know that history, in all its details, can be a companion for calm and curiosity alike.